Thank you all for joining us for the fifth installment in the webinar series, Achieving Excellence and Innovation in Family, School, and Community Engagement. My name is Lindsay Tirico, and I'm the moderator for this webinar. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, this webinar series features different approaches to promoting systemic family, school, and community engagement in support of student learning. This webinar series is brought to you by a partnership that includes the U.S. Department of Education, the United Way Worldwide, the National PTA, CETL, and the Harvard Family Research Project. Today's webinar topic explores how building strategic community partnerships can help foster community engagement in education. Community-based organizations play an important role in helping to connect schools to the families in their communities and enhancing the learning opportunities students have by providing enrichment opportunities that are aligned with what students learn in school. Community partners also serve as a valuable bridge between schools and families and can help schools reach families who may not feel comfortable interacting with the formal school structure. As President Obama noted in the Blueprint for Reform, communities and families have vitally important roles to play in supporting their children's education. Effective education reform must support families, schools, and communities' efforts to work in partnership to help promote student achievement. As policymakers become more aware of the importance of family and community engagement, we can help them understand how to incorporate these elements into education reform initiatives by highlighting examples of successful community partnerships that can serve as useful models. Recently, we've seen recent research emerge from the research field in support of family and community engagement as a core component of effective school reform. Tony Brake and his colleagues from the Consortium on Chicago School Research found that parent, school, and community ties represent one of 5 essential ingredients for effective school reform. This study, based on rigorous methodology, found that family and community engagement must be present in order for other essential ingredients to work. These elements are interconnected, and the effectiveness of each one depends on the presence and strength of the others. These findings provide a strong argument for making family and community engagement a cornerstone of education reform efforts, rather than an add-on or something that's done if time or funding allows. As the study showed, without this essential element, the other ingredients of school reform simply do not work effectively. Today's presenters will discuss the work they've done to build effective community partnerships that help connect families and schools to enhance student achievement. We know that families need to be engaged in order for students to experience academic success. The presenters for the webinar include Reverend Brenda Girton-Mitchell, Director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the U.S. Department of Education, Jane Quinn, Director of the National Center for Community Schools at the Children's Aid Society, Erasmo Salcido, founder of the Cesar Chavez Public Charter Schools for Public Policy and a Promise Neighborhoods grantee, Helen Westmoreland, Director of Program Quality at the Flamboyant Foundation, and Michelle Mittler-Crombie, Vice President of Community Development at the United Way of Lake County in Illinois. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Reverend Brenda Girton-Mitchell. Reverend Girton-Mitchell is the Director for the Department's Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, whose mission is to promote student achievement by connecting schools and community-based organizations, both secular and faith-based. Reverend Girton-Mitchell brings more than 30 years of experience to the department. She has a bachelor's degree in elementary education from Ball State University, a Master of Elementary Education from Indiana University, Purdue, a Juris Doctor degree with honors from the Chicago-Kent College of Law, and a Master of Divinity degree from Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the department, her experience includes being an elementary teacher, a legislative assistant to former Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, and director of the Washington office for the National Council of Churches of Christ in the U.S. Reverend Girton-Mitchell will share some opening remarks about how community partnerships help to address the needs of schools. Please note that we will be taking questions at the end of each segment of the presentation, so be sure to submit your questions through the Q&A chat room. This webinar will be recorded, and an archive link will be made available. So without further ado, Reverend Gerton Mitchell.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to join on this webinar call this afternoon to share with you some of the work of the Department of Education Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. The President established through executive order just about 2 years ago, on February the 5th of 2009, these White House offices and the center offices. There are 11 agencies in addition to the Department of Education that have an Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. And our responsibility is to build bridges between the federal government, nonprofit organizations, both secular and faith-based, to serve Americans in various points of need. And education is one of those areas where we know if we can improve the quality of education, we can improve our entire society. We're focused on bringing together partners in local school districts. We have many organizations that are already doing good work in schools, with schools. And so to find ways to increase that capacity for people to work together for our children is one of our main goals as we rally the community so that everyone is ready to champion the education issue. This past year, we've been visiting communities to stand with them to celebrate what they do and encourage them to do even more to make sure that we're strengthening the capacity of our schools. We know that there's a tremendous achievement gap in many of our communities, and yet we know if we pull together identifying the issues, we can encourage cradle-to-grave education and get everybody to realize that we're to be lifelong learners. We have many faith leaders and community organizations that have come to the center to say we're doing good work. So if we can lift up that work, we can show some models that are already in place, we think that we can have many more communities that have a hands-on commitment to improving our schools. And it is a fact that many people will come to a faith-based organization, a church or a mosque or center, to say they want help with mentoring, they need to be tutored, before they would even go necessarily back to their own teachers sometimes. So we're trying to help these organizations know that there is a role for everyone to play. And families will often go to a faith leader to say that the family has needs because they see that as a source for encouragement and moral support and emotional support as they go through the challenges that just come naturally with life. Over the next several months, in fact, we're going back out into the community after having had listening sessions for the past couple of years. We're going back to a select number of communities to look at best practices, to share data, to help people see what the most effective ways are, and to show the government as a partner, even though we may not be providing direct financial support, we can help people attract attention to their work, and very often that will put the right partners together to help us achieve for our young people at every level. One of the major objectives of the department this year is to work for the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Act, which has previously been known as the No Child Left Behind legislation, which was designed to help reform our schools. And we believe that has to be a grassroots initiative, and people have to believe that they're being heard, and the remedies that are put in place have to be flexible enough to meet the needs of every child in every community. So it's my desire as director of this center to help make educational success kind of a household mantra. Everybody's going to be talking about what does it mean to be the best student that I can be. And we want to help churches and community groups be partners in that work. The President said in the State of the Union that the responsibility for education doesn't just begin in the classroom. It begins in our homes and our communities. And so we'll be lifting up that message as we join in the race to win the future for our kids through education. There are some wonderful examples that I'll just lift up a few. Many of you may have already heard about the Harlem's Children's Zone, and now in Orlando there's a similar program going on that's built after that model. We're talking about being able to measure the drop in crime because young people have more attention being paid to their educational need, and multiple community centers are being built in the community so that the children have constructive things to occupy their time. In Fredericksburg, Virginia, there's a faith-based and education council that came together to create a model for organizations to assess the needs of the community because there's not a one-size-fits-all solution to this. And one of the things that has been the most beneficial is having family engagement events. And family engagement doesn't mean the same thing now that it meant 30 years ago. Some parents may never get to go into the school during the day, but that doesn't mean they can't be engaged in the activities that their children undertake around education. So expanding our mindset of what it means to be engaged and giving people tools will be one of the measures of success of the work that we're trying to do. So I'm looking forward on the call today to hear remarks from others, and just most of all, I want you to know that the Department of Education is serious about the work of engaging communities, to work with families and schools, to lift up our children and to inspire them to be the best that they can be. And what we do from cradle to career will make a significant difference in improving the quality of life for everybody in our nation.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. We're now going to turn over to the question portion of this webinar, and we have several questions. Our first question is, how does the Department of Education Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships work with the other federal centers for faith-based and community initiatives?
Wonderful question. First of all, we have a daily telephone call with the staffs of all of the departments to find out what our major initiatives are and where there's overlap in our work. For example, when we look at HHS, Health and Human Services, they have the Move On program. And when we're talking with schools and community groups, we also lift up the work of the other departments. I was at the Department of Justice on yesterday. We're talking about anti-bullying. How do we help churches and communities, organizations spread the message of the things that have to be done to help people know that bullying is not accepted and tools to get people involved in more effective ways. So we talk to each other on a regular basis, and we actually do program planning together.
Okay, thank you. And our next question is, how does the Department of Education plan to use the information gathered at these site visits in 30 cities?
Well, we're already using that information in shaping the pilots that we're setting up. So, for example, if we're in a community and where we heard that we have people who want to volunteer, but they haven't been trained. They don't know how to get into the school system. So then you build a partnership with the principals, the local community leaders, and they work together to shape the way to prepare people to work in the buildings. So whether they're working in an administrative side or they're working hands-on with children, we work that out on a school-by-school basis with the school district and the groups that have come together in that community. So there's not a template that we've put together. We're actually doing needs assessment with each community.
Thanks, Brenda. We've received quite a number of questions asking what a CBO is. Can you talk about that?
Yes,
and maybe give some.
CBO is a community-based organization, and that could be Boys and Girls Clubs. That could be your YWCA. Any organization that's developed in a community to help meet needs of that community. So it's a very broad term, and we add community and faith-based so that you know we're talking about faith-based as well as secular organizations in the community.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks again, Brenda. It was great to hear about how the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships is engaging communities into the development of education reform plans and other initiatives. I would now like to introduce Jane Quinn. Jane Quinn is a social worker and youth worker for 4 decades of experience that include direct service with children and families, program development, fundraising, grant making, research, and advocacy. She currently serves as the Vice President for Community Schools at the Children's Aid Society in New York City, where she directs the National Center for Community Schools and contributes strategic planning and sustainability expertise to the Children's Aid Society's 22 local communities. Prior to that, she served as program director at the Wallace Reader's Digest Funds and directed a national study of community-based organizations for the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Jane co-edited a book entitled Community Schools in Action, Lessons from a Decade of Practice, and writes a regular column on youth development practice issues for Youth Today. Jane will share about the value of the community schools model and the importance of creating effective partnerships. Jane?
Hi, everybody all across the country. I can see that you are indeed coming from all across the country, and that is so exciting. So I work for one of those CBOs, one of those community-based organizations that is partnering with public schools in New York City. So the advice that I'm going to be giving you is very much practice-based. And also I work for and direct a National Center for Community Schools. So I'll be sharing some advice that comes from some of our colleagues in other parts of the country. I will be talking about a strategy called Community Schools, and that is really a proven strategy for putting all these pieces together that we've been talking about in this webinar series, that is putting together family, school, and community partnerships. The first thing I want to say is that when we talk about community schools, we're talking about a strategy, not a program. Now, there are programmatic elements to most community schools, and I will be talking about that. But what I want our listeners to be thinking about is that we're talking about a strategy here, and what we're talking about is a strategy for organizing the resources of the community around student success. That's a definition that I heard from a former school superintendent, and I thought that it was so concise and so on point that I am sharing it with you all across the country. So I'm going to give you 4 quick definitions of community schools. These are not 4 different definitions, but really 4 snapshots of the same thing. So the first definition is our definition from Pat Harvey. The second definition I want to share with you is a definition from the Coalition for Community Schools, which is a consortium of groups all across the country, 170 national, regional, state, and local initiatives that represent about 5,000 community schools. So this is really a consensus definition from the field that emphasizes that a community school is both a place, that is, it's a school, and it's also a set of partnerships that the school has with a variety of community resources. And these partners and the school have an integrated focus on improving student learning, strengthening families, and improving community well-being. So I think this is a good definition, a kind of standard definition that is represented in the field. And now I'm going to move on to a third snapshot, another way of thinking about this work. We call this the Developmental Triangle. What this picture represents is that in the community school we are endeavoring to wrap all the good stuff around children. So you can see in our picture that we have a young person at the center of our attention. We never take our eye off that prize. And we are connecting 3 big sets of things that we know make a difference in children's learning and healthy development. On the left-hand side of the triangle, we have a core instructional program, which is what schools are primarily responsible for. And the partners connect 2 big sets of things to the core instructional program. They connect enrichment, which is academic, social, cultural, and recreational. Partners do that largely through before and after school programs and summer camps, summer enrichment programs. Then on the bottom of the triangle, we have a set of services that are designed to remove barriers to children's learning and healthy development. And there we're talking about things like medical, dental, mental health, and social services. And as you can see, we are connecting the triangle, the corners of the triangle. We're managing those corners and connecting these three big sets of services so that they are aligned with one another and really promoting children's school success and their healthy development. Finally, my fourth definition, the fourth snapshot of this phenomenon we call community schools, is what I call the cocktail party definition, or the elevator speech, that a community school compared to a traditional school has extended services, extended hours, and extended relationships. The school has a swinging door. It reaches out to the community to serve the community, and it brings the community in to serve the children and families in the school. So I hope that that's clear, and if it's not, I know you'll bombard me with questions, which would be great. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Now, I do want to say that we know a lot about the key ingredients of a community school. We know that education is first. The reason that community partners are working in the school is that they want to promote children's learning and healthy development. In most of the models of community schools, and there are a number of terrific models around the country, in most of the models there is a lead community agency that is the primary partner with the school staff. And that lead agency is a partner, not a tenant. The lead agency generally is there during the school day as well as during the non-school hours, and so the lead agency has a full-time presence. The lead agency does joint planning with the principal and with the other school staff, and the lead agency is fully integrated into the governance of the school district, into the school leadership team, the school safety committee, the pupil personnel team, or whatever the table is called where the needs of individual children are discussed. And although we say that community schools is a strategy, not a program, I'm showing you some of the typical program components that you do see in a community school. You can see that there's a lot of emphasis on those two legs of the triangle that I talked about, and lots of emphasis on parental involvement, but also services for parents that include adult education. So these are typical program components that you see, and many elementary schools also have early childhood programs that are fully integrated into the kindergarten and early grades. So we get to the so what question. You know, this strategy is based on research, but it has also been the subject of numerous evaluations around the country. Some of the work of the Children's Aid Society produced some of the first results. I would say the results have been coming out and mounting over the last 15 years. And I'm going to give you a summary of those results, which you can see in front of you that community schools definitely have an impact on academic performance. They also have an impact on attendance rates, and that includes both student and teacher attendance rates. Lots of evaluations have showed improvements in school safety and school climate, greater parent involvement, in fact, significantly greater parent involvement. Often, partners who come into community schools are organizations like ours that have a lot of competence around working with families. And in one of our own evaluations, an external team from Fordham University found 167% more parent involvement in our community school middle school than in a control school. That's beyond statistically significant. The last bullet point I think is really important. All of them are important, of course, but the fact is that teachers in community schools say that they are now free to teach, and that the higher teacher attendance rates in community schools are directly related to the fact that teachers say now we don't have to be the social worker and every other kind of professional. We can be the teacher, and we have other professionals whom we can partner with. But I do want to say that you don't get those results if you don't follow these principles of effective partnerships. So I'm going to give you 9 quick principles And these really come out of the practice of folks like us who have been working in community schools over the last 15 to 20 years. The first one is about being strategic, and that is this is advice for schools, to get the partners you need, not the ones who are most readily available. We always advise that a needs assessment should drive the selection of the partners. And the needs assessment really should be looking at both school data and community data to make sure we understand who the children are and who the families are at the school. So being strategic means getting the partners you need who can help you achieve your goals. There is no substitute for joint planning, and that is not a one-time event. Joint planning really is an ongoing event, but the initial joint planning is tremendously important. The third piece of advice is making sure you are all on the same page as you work together. So clarifying your vision and mission is an important part of that initial planning, and then checking in with one another to make sure you stay on the same page. Principle number 4 is to start small and build gradually. The needs assessment should drive decisions about what are the most urgent needs, and it pays to have some quick wins, to start with success and take time to build trust among the partners. Strategy number 5, or principle number 5, is bringing parents into the planning process early and thinking of parents as assets and partners and key informants, not only as clients for services. Principle number 6 is to share decision-making, and we saw in the Tony Bright research that was referenced earlier that strong school leaders have an inclusive leadership style. They know how to share the leadership with others in the school, including their community partners. Principle number 7 is preparing team members to work together. That is doing joint professional development both at the outset of a partnership and on an ongoing basis, because collaboration requires skills. Principle number 8 is to stay flexible. Even though you may have done terrific planning, you can't always account for every eventuality, and we know that our schools are operating in a very dynamic environment. Finally, principle number 9 is keep developing your team's capacity. Again, we saw that in the Tony Bright research, how important it is that the school has the ability to build professional capacity, and that is true whether we're talking about the faculty of a school or the school and its community partners. We recommend having annual planning retreats and doing some team building during that retreat, and we also know how important that is to account for the turnover on both sides of the bridge, on the community side and on the school side. So that is what I wanted to say to you, and I'm happy to entertain your questions, and I think my job now is to turn this back over to Lindsay.
That's right, Jane. Thank you. And thank you for your enlightening presentation. I'm sure that many of the schools and organizations joining us appreciate hearing about the lessons learned from the community schools model and the general principles of effective partnerships. I've received several questions from our participants. And the first question is, are community schools K through 12, and what age or grade range are community schools most successful?
Great question. There are community schools at all of those levels. The strategy is effective at all of those levels, and the strategy often includes elementary, that is pre-K programs. In a couple of our own community schools in New York, we have early Head Start and Head Start, which of course works on the whole issue of school readiness and on the school-family connection. So I would say that I know about community schools at all of those levels, and all of those levels are producing very impressive results. Of course, what you focus on at the high school is very different from what you focus on at the elementary school. That probably goes without saying, but I think that most of the high schools that we're familiar with really are focusing on on keeping kids on track toward high school graduation, and of course partners are bringing a lot to that table in terms of working with young people around their career and education aspirations and working on college and career readiness. I will mention that the Coalition for Community Schools, of which Children's Aid is a proud founding partner, has a wonderful monograph on high school level community schools, and they also have resources on other aspects of community schools. So there's a lot of help out there for those of you who want to understand this strategy better. And of course, resources are available from our National Center for Community Schools, and I think you're seeing our website right in front of you on your screen. What are some of the other questions?
So another question we've received is, how are community schools typically funded? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. That's something I think about every single day. In our own work in New York City, about 2/3 of the funding that Children's Aid is adding to the community schools. So we're adding money to the money that the New York City Department of Education is already spending, right? About 2/3 of that money is public, the other third is private. So the funding comes from a variety of different sources, including on the public side, several U.S. Department of Education sources like 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Of course, 20 initiatives around the country also have full-service community schools grants from the U.S. Department of Education. We are using Medicaid funding to pay for medical and mental health services. We are using Early Head Start and Head Start dollars from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. In our work in New York City, we are also using some state resources, the Advantage After School program and the Extended Day Violence Prevention program. And then on the private side, the funding is raised from United Ways, who are, of course, a partner in this webinar series, but also from private foundations, corporations, and individuals. So I would say that we are braiding a variety of funding sources together and really braiding them together all around the same set of results, which have to do, of course, with students' school success and some of the other outcomes that I talked about.
Great, thank you. And one more question. The question is, what are the greatest challenges in maintaining strategic partnerships to support community schools?
Well, I think the greatest challenges are that the context changes regularly, and so I think the partners have to be very flexible, very fleet of foot. I think the funding is definitely a challenge. We are all living in very tough economic times, and so I think we have to, right now, I think we're all working twice as hard to stay in place. We just have to really work hard and be strategic about the fundraising. And I think that we can never forget that when we are working in partnership, that we have to continually work on the relationship aspect of the work. The relationship aspect of the work is central. Many people, including Tony Breik, have written books about this, about the importance of trust. Trust has to be earned every day in a partnership. So I think that we can never forget how important relationships are in the work that we're doing.
Great. Thank you so much. And our next set of presenters are Erasma Salcido and Helen Westmoreland. Erasma Salcido is the CEO and founder of the Cesar Chavez Public Charter Schools for Public Policy and the president and founder of the DC Promise Neighborhood Initiative. As the daughter of Mexican-American immigrant farmers, Erasma came to the United States at 14 years of age without speaking English. She received a bachelor's degree in business administration from California State University and a master in education, administration, and social planning from the Harvard University School of Education. In 1998, she founded the Cesar Chavez Public Charter Schools for Public Policy in Washington, D.C., to create an institution where the poorest students have access to the highest quality education. In 2009, she developed the DC Promise Neighborhood Initiative, replicating the Harlem Children's Zone in the Parkside, Kenilworth neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Under her leadership, the initiative was awarded a planning grant from the U.S. Department of Education. Helen Westmoreland is the Director of Public Quality at the Flamboyant Foundation, a private family foundation which invests strategically to improve the quality of pre-K through 12 public education in Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. She is responsible for identifying and integrating research and promising practices into the Foundation's initiatives to help DC educators, school leaders, and schools effectively engage families in supporting student achievement. In this capacity, Helen identifies partners, strategies, and exemplary programs that will help Flamboyant achieve broad impact, and she develops systems to evaluate these results. Before coming to Flamboyant, Helen spent almost 5 years working for the Harvard Family Research Project. Prior to that, she worked with community-based after-school programs in Durham, North Carolina. Helen received a master's degree in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and bachelor's degrees in Spanish and biological anthropology from Duke University. Helen and Erasma will share about the role of community partners in carrying out the mission and strategies of the DC Promise Neighborhoods Institute project. Erasma, I will now like to turn it over to you for your part of the presentation.
Thank you so much. What an honor to be able to speak to those that are in the webinar that are interested in finding out what the DC Promise Neighborhood Initiative is doing to engage residents and families to make sure that every child in the Parkside Kenilworth community will be successful in school and beyond. The task of the Promise Neighborhood in the Washington, D.C. area is to make sure that we create solutions that are evidence-based to make sure that we address the needs of every child in that community from cradle to college to career. The reason I believe we were selected to do this work is because we've been in that community for the past 7 years. And for the past 2 years, we've been working very hard in that community, building trust in order for us to achieve our goal. As I mentioned, it took us 2 years in order for us to gather the community so we can communicate to them that we value the community and that our values needed to be reflected in all the work that we do. And that is building capacity in that community and making sure that we would take the time to build relationships so they could then see that we were serious about engaging them in every decision that we are making to make sure that when we implement the Promise Neighborhood, which it will be next year, since this year we receive a planning grant, and we are engaging the residents in the planning. In that community, we have 7,000 families. 2,000 of those families are children. And this community, like many other communities, face many social ills, which it was what motivated us to want to create a very ambitious mission. Many other families are single family, are headed by a single family mom, and the employment rate is up to 20-30%. The mission then for us is to make sure that we increase the number of children who complete their education, again, from cradle to college to career, and then they are ready to compete in the 21st century economy, but equally important that they can come back to their communities and make a difference. Our vision was inspired by the America's Promise vision. We felt that if we can come together as a community and promise the families and children of that community that we are going to deliver the 5 promises that every child in America is entitled to, and that is caring adults, feeling safe, having a healthy start, having a quality education and opportunities to get back. That if we could do that together, then we will definitely make the vision of the Promise Neighborhood a reality. We have about 60 partners or more engaged in this initiative. As you can imagine, having to develop a comprehensive approach from cradle to college to career requires a variety of partners. And what this has allowed us to do is to engage partners that otherwise, when you are only focused on education, might not happen. We have, partners with health, housing, early care, foundations, higher education, developers, banks, evaluation. Examples of those partners is the children hospital Now we have a van every week that comes to 3 of the schools in the footprint. The Department of Housing Authority has applied for a choice neighborhood in order to improve some of the public housing there. Early care, we have Educare, which they're going to build a 0 to 5 center there. And we've been working with the Urban Institute to develop a strong evaluation piece, and also with Georgetown University. So we feel very fortunate that we have all those resources to make sure that we do make that community a promised neighborhood community. Obviously, key to our success will be the engagement of community, especially families in that community. It's really important that we empower them to believe that they are the ones that are going to change that community and create opportunities for the children that grow in that community. That's critical to us. The way we are achieving that goal is we have a structure that allows us to have the residents as equal partners. To us, from day one, 2 years ago, we knew that we needed to go out to the community and be transparent about the work that we were doing. So 2 years ago, we committed to doing monthly community dinners with the 7 neighborhoods of our footprint are able to come and hear from us, and for us to hear from them how we're going to shape this promised neighborhood. We also committed to doing retreats. We just had one 2 weeks ago where the residents were able to tell us what is their vision of the promised neighborhood, because the promised neighborhood requires that we address 10 goals, 5 academic and 5 community goals. So we needed to hear their voices. Also, very important to the process is that the fact that there are 10 goals, then we form 10 groups for each of the goals, and in each of those groups, we require that we have a resident that is co-chair because we want them to feel that they're equal partners in this process. And each group is required to have a 1/3 resident representative. So when they're discussing solutions, they need to hear from the residents, and the solutions have to be evidence-based. So the Urban Institute plays a role in making sure that we have the data that we need to make decisions. Then each group, with the resident input, will let the principals of those 4 schools that are in that footprint know what solutions they think that they need to implement, and then the principals have to make the decision or propose the solutions that they think they can implement in their schools. But also what's really key to this is that we have a partnership with the traditional schools. Chavez is a charter school, and for the first time, which is not very typical to see traditional schools and charter schools work together, this is a great opportunity to make the commitment to create strong schools and strong communities. So I will now pass it to Helen to explain in detail how a working group works. And as you can see, what guides the work of each of the 10 working groups is that it's really important that we build relationships. That matters a great deal. It has taken us this long, at least for Chavez, 7 years to gain the trust of that community, because typically in those communities, many people come and make promises and don't deliver. And that once we build the relationships and people are willing to commit everything to achieve a goal, and then more importantly, we have to have the right structures for that to happen. So Helen would explain in more detail how we make it happen in the working groups. And thank you so much for your time.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being with us today. Iracema has just talked about family and community engagement in really the systems level of this initiative. And as many of you know, we all have very different definitions of family and community engagement. And we are going to, in fact, jump back and forth across both systems. A little quickly, so I apologize if I speak fast. Iracema has given you an overview of family and community engagement in the initiative of Promise Neighborhoods, which encompasses 4 schools in the footprint. So I'm going to really bring it down to the planning level of what family and community looks like in those partner schools. And we are getting off the ground now, so a lot of our lessons learned are very early lessons learned, and most of our reflection questions for you are meant to be things to think more of, and rather than concrete answers. So So our membership is made up of a third residents. We believe very strongly that community voice needs to be at the table in doing this. We're also encompass families, community-based organizations, and community leaders, and current and former school staff, building on the assets of the community. So, for example, the community has told us in retreats they're very proud of fathers' involvement, and there are a number of really outstanding male role models in the neighborhood. So we've recruited them to be a part of this team. We've also made an effort to ensure that the perspective of each of our partner schools is represented. So we have a window into what family and community looks like in quite different settings. Lastly, we're lucky enough to have some great national leaders in family and community engagement in Washington, D.C., including Appleseed and the National PTA, and some of their senior leadership is part of our membership team for this as well. Holding the group together is a leadership team of 4 people. First, we have a resident co-chair who is a longtime veteran educator in one of our partner elementary schools. We also have another co-chair who's a local expert, and that is the DC Parent Information Resource Center, who has provided technical assistance to schools in DC and in this particular neighborhood for many years. Urban Institute is our partner that provides data and evaluation support to the team, everything from we're going to need you to ask these 3 questions in the focus groups you're holding across the neighborhood to can you help us find baseline data? They are there at the table to help do that. And then lastly, we have a facilitator. Irasema, in starting this initiative years ago, recruited in-kind staff support to keep these working groups kind of moving along. My role at Flamboyant Foundation is to do that. So let me give you a little bit of background about what that means. Flamboyant is a private family philanthropy here in D.C., and we are focused exclusively on family engagement and education advocacy that drives student achievement. So my role is not just to keep the agendas moving along, but also to really bring to bear some of the research and promising practices that we have learned and will be using in our work. So this slide, Applying Research to Practice, is a little bit of the nuts and bolts overview of what that looks like based on our fairly extensive review of research, including what types of family engagement matter most. We're not always, as a field, very clear on our definitions, as well as what we can glean from the very little implementation research that's out there. I'm not going to go over this citation by citation, but if other folks have questions at the end, I'll give you my contact information, and I'm happy to answer those. Let me premise this slide by also saying that our work focuses on family engagement at the school, classroom, and child level, and that this is a piece of family and community supporting learning within the Promise Neighborhood initiatives, but not the whole thing. So in that more narrow definition, specifically around what we've come to around what impacts academic achievement, we've sorted out and found it's helpful for schools to know if we have to make trade-offs, what should those be related to family engagement? So you can see here that some of the higher impact strategies for student achievement are personalized and are largely teacher-driven. The lower impact strategies are offered siloed off as something else, not directly connected to learning or driven more by getting parents to show up rather than figuring out how can we help parents really guide and support their kids' learning in really specific, actionable ways. So the lower impact things for student achievement are actually critically important things for schools for other outcomes, but this is what we found for if you're trying to move the needle for kids. So given this background on family engagement, let me tell you a little bit about how we're applying this to the Family and Community Support Learning Working Group for the Promise Neighborhoods. So to start, a little bit of context for this in D.C., if any of you have read the news about education in D.C., you know that we have had quite a few contentious reforms here. And so that has created a very polarized context from community to community within the district. So much so that we have to make a tremendous effort to reach consensus and get over our differences. Second, as Irasema mentioned, there's been an incredible churn and absence of sustainability for education programs, particularly in the Parkside Kenilworth neighborhood where we're focusing. I was in a meeting last week where a community resident actually used the word prostituted for how they felt when biggest, newest research-based program comes to town. So there's a real need to kind of build capacity and sustainability along the way. Third, DC's school system has not always embraced the voices of families and community members. And given how quickly recent reform efforts have moved, many folks feel like they just want to be heard. Lastly, when it comes to implementation, schools will need a lot more information and technical assistance in how to best invest very limited time and resources in ways that will help kids. So given this context, this is what our planning process has looked like for family and community engagement in these 4 schools. We are trying to ensure that it achieves something. Programs come and go, but outcomes will persist. So at the end of the day, we want to support learning and be clear about what that means for families and communities to do that. Secondly, we believe we sell our communities short if we think their only value added is just to say what they need. Family community engagement is very hard work, as many of you know, so we need to create a table where we can think through this and build capacity along the way in a problem-solving manner. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the planning process in the next slide, but just want to say that what we did was map out our major questions to answer over the next 3 months so that we are being very transparent with our members as well as any other residents that would like to attend a meeting of what we're trying to accomplish when. At the end of the day, we just have to manage the process and people's time in a respectful way. Next, we want to assess where we want to build in opportunities to look at research and promising practices along the way, not in a very front-loaded way, as I've just kind of given you all, but in an organic way as the planning process goes so that we can take a chance to look and say, what do we have already? What are our gaps, and what do we need to build upon? So to address these principles, we are using 5 guiding questions for our planning process over the next 3 or 4 months. What does family and community support for learning look like when it is successful? What barriers are standing in the way of this success? What strategies must we consider to overcome these barriers? And what programs and activities within these strategy areas should we use? And then lastly, what will our recommendations for implementation be? Some of you may recognize these as they're adapted from United Way's really robust outcomes-based planning process. And we've learned in planning with our partners that we often want to jump to the what should we do, but we wanted to build in a foundation and a common language for really where we are trying to head so that if we need to have disagreements and address some of the challenges I talked to you about, we can do so really as equal partners across the table from one another. So a couple of closing thoughts and our current reflections on this process. First is how do we ensure that our family and community support for learning planning process penetrates beyond the coalition of the willing. Family and community engagement can't be about those who are already engaged deciding for others what they should do. Stepping up isn't a strategy that will reach everyone, so we really need to ensure that we're building in the perspective of those who haven't traditionally been involved in their kids' education in our partner schools. Second, how do we engage school staff and leaders in critical reflection around family and community engagement for learning? Our group has already talked about some strategies that implicate our partner schools in fundamentally changing their approach to families. So we need to ensure that the folks, particularly the school leaders in these settings, are part of the conversation so that if we come up with recommendations about what schools need to do differently, they are ready to move on those and feel a shared accountability to do so. Third, we've been talking a lot about how we meaningfully measure family and community support for learning as it relates to our vision of success. The federal government has given us 2 quantitative planning indicators to help guide this work, but the membership of this team feels like we need to add to those to capture not just quantity, such as number of teachers at parents at parent-teacher conferences, but also the quality of this work. So how do we walk away knowing that families and communities feel like they are more empowered to support their kids' learning? Lastly, how do we ensure sustainability along the way? Irasema in the overview slide of our structure showed you we have a really robust fundraising team that has committed to seeing the plans from these teams through, but we are always conscious that we walk in the shadows of the other programs and initiatives before us that may have come and gone, so we keep that in our minds. So with those last planning questions, I will turn it over. I don't know if we lost some time in the technical difficulties, but Irasema and I are happy to answer questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Helen and Erasima. It sounds like you've done some amazing work in forming and maintaining community partnerships in Washington, D.C. And thank you all for your patience with some of the technical difficulties we've had. We've received several questions from participants. So I'll start with our first question. How do you identify families and other stakeholders to be included in the planning team, and how often does the planning team meet?
I can talk about how we identify the members of each of the 10 working groups. As I mentioned before, we've been working at this for the past 2 years, and we have had community dinners. We also have a resident engagement person that is from that community. And through those activities, we have identified residents that want to be part of the Promise neighborhood, and we have allowed them to have the opportunity to be in those 10 groups. And as long as they're residents of the Parkside Kenilworth community, they automatically become members of a working group that they feel they can contribute something to.
Great. And I have another question for you, Erasima. How did you identify the needs of the students, families, and communities the DC Promise Neighborhoods Institute is working with?
True needs assessment, but as we mentioned before, we are extremely fortunate to have Urban Institute work with us again. They've been involved with us for the past 2 years, and the Urban Institute has a very comprehensive data information on DC, so they're able to look at the community that we're serving, and for each working group, identify the number of students that live there, the ages, what schools they go to, DC CAS scores, which is the standardized test that they take in DC. So all that information is what we give to each of the working groups depending on what their goal is, so they can look and see where the gaps are, and together decide that then they need to find evidence-based solutions to close those gaps. So we're in the process of the planning, and we're in the process of collecting the data from the residents through the different means that I described to you, the dinners, the retreats, and we're getting ready to do a needs assessment in addition to what is already available through the Urban Institute.
Great, and we have time for one more question. What are some of the challenges or pushback you experienced in the 2 years of planning and building relationships with the community?
I think what Helen sort of mentioned earlier, which I think is the experience in many of these communities that are in great need, is really trusting that this is for real. And for us, I think it has not been much of a pushback as much as maybe a different kind of pressure when we are out there and people believe us. They're really expecting us to be able to deliver in these 5 promises. So for us, it's more letting people know that this is a 10 to 20-year project and that it is important that everyone takes ownership. So I think the challenge is going to be not the initial stage. I think we've, again, been very lucky because of the partners and our history in that community and because of the values that we make clear right from the beginning, that people have seen our actions and believe that we have the capacity to deliver on what we're describing. But the challenge is traditionally you don't, foundations or other organizations, nonprofit or private or public, are not used to committing for long term to a project. And I think that's going to be our challenge to some extent. But I think we're taking care of that by the structure that we have in place. We have those 10 working groups, and we recruited organizations to give in-kind, like the Flamboyant Foundation. They're providing in-kind to be able to facilitate each of these groups, so organizations can see firsthand how we're planning this and how they can see themselves in 5-10 years from now, and the residents can see themselves 5-10 years from now. And they're going to be able to see the results, touch and feel the results, because we're going to be there day in and day out. So it's just how do we make sure that we sustain this? Because to see the results, to take a child that is born today and making sure that they move through the system and are successful and graduate ready to go to college and enter the world of work, that's going to take, 20 years or so.
Well, thank you so much, Erasma and Helen, and thank you all for your questions. Our last presenter is Michelle Mittler-Crombie. Michelle Mittler-Crombie is the Vice President of Community Development at the United Way of Lake County in Illinois. She is responsible for providing vision and leadership to the team of volunteers and staff committed to investing resources that will prepare our children to succeed in a changing world. During her career at United Way, she has been an agent of change, moving the organization to focus on specific community issues and developing concrete plans to address the needs. She has developed an education continuum that empowers parents to engage their children at all ages and successfully engages the community in this work. Michelle will share about how creating strategic collaborations is contributing to the goals of the Family Engagement for High School Success project her local United Way is coordinating. Michelle, please go right ahead.
Hello, Lindsay. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Well, I'm here to represent all of the United Ways who are bringing together diverse partners to improve education, income, and health. And so if you haven't engaged with your local United Way, I'm here to tell you that you should. We probably all know by now the importance of family engagement. But what if the families don't know that they need to be involved, simply don't see the value of participating in their education, or want to be involved but have no idea how to do so? Enter the community partner. I believe that developing strong, vital, and creative community relationships is the key to empowering parents and eventually increasing their understanding of success by increasing parent engagement in a local high-need, low-income high school. In this needed-it-yesterday world, it was certainly a luxury to be able to spend 6 months to gather information and plan. The goals of our Family Engagement Project are to improve high school attendance rates, academic performance, and behavior in order to ultimately increase high school graduation rates. In order to impact these, parents have to be involved. But we found that in order for parents to be involved, the community and schools had to show them how important it really is. Our first step in the planning process was understanding the barriers. In order to do this, we had to talk to a lot of people. We relied heavily on the community partners for this. We found that there were many reasons why students were not graduating on time, but they tended to fall into 3 categories. Parents didn't know the requirements for graduation or attendance. They didn't know how their students were doing or how to get help. In focus groups with students, many proudly told us of how they prevented their parents from getting the progress reports or the absentee calls. The students simply can't be the gatekeepers for this information. A new online grade and attendance tracking system was being developed, but with a huge percentage of the families without computers and the internet, this too is destined to be ineffective. Our solution to this was twofold. One, to work with the high school and community to improve the communications, orientation, and the attendance at parent-teacher conferences. But the other was to ensure better usage of the online tracking system by making sure that families had computer access and knew how to do this. We did this in 2 ways. We put refurbished computers in congregations and community centers for public use. And then we developed a computer learn and earn program, which is a series of trainings for parents with no computer at home and no computer experience. It uses corporate and community volunteers to teach them the basics of how to use a computer and that new online tracking system. The last session of the series is about how parents can help their child succeed in school, and it's actually one of the favorites of the recipients. At the end, parents can receive a used computer donated to United Way, and refurbished by a community group of retired computer professionals. Now, I have to say that we certainly would not have come up with this plan if we had simply guessed what was needed for this group. So the help from our community fell into two main categories, planning and programming. The community partners are very key in planning any kind of intervention. Those who are very close to the families can tell us what stands between them and attending school. Our first meetings were with those community organizations. Make sure that when you are selecting community organizations that you look for people who are willing to be candid with you. If they tell you what they think you want to hear, you will never come to understand the rarely spoken realities, and those are indeed some of the most important things. These community partners also knew of many assets that fell under the radar screen, such as a mom who tutors a couple of students in a church basement every day after school. Finally, no plan makes sense without talking directly to the consumers and, as our last speaker said, getting them involved in the solution. Our community partners are invaluable at getting families to the table. Many focus group parents showed up only because someone they knew called them and asked them to participate. In programming, there were many, many ways that community partners were helpful. Churches and congregations contributed sites for tutoring, computer labs, often staffed with congregation members, and they put messages supporting school events and education in general in their bulletins. Again, because they said it, it became much more credible than if just United Way was saying it or the school was saying it. There was also an extensive community effort to increase attendance at the freshman parent meetings and at the parent-teacher conferences. These are important because they're the places where parents find out much of the information that they weren't getting before, and they told us that they didn't have. Even grocery stores, gas stations, coffee shops, you name it, put up reminders on their doors or on their signs to tell people to remember to attend these events. In addition, community partners can be goodwill ambassadors, a real bridge between the schools and the families. When selecting community partners, you first need to spend some significant time defining the who you want to reach. Get it down as narrow as possible. There's a huge difference between high school students and low-income freshmen who were chronically truant in 8th grade. Then you need to understand their circles of influence. Reach out to the people, activities, or groups that are closest to them. Find out who they talk to, who they listen to, or where they gather. The groups I've listed in this slide are just examples of who parents might be influenced by. The real list will be very long and very diverse. Here's a hint. When narrowing down the list of community groups that are already established, use those that are already established. Don't try to create your own. But make sure that they really do have a real influence over the people that you've identified as your targets. Some of the ones for us that we used in this area were our high school faith council. It's a group of pastors of all faiths who meet monthly to decide how to work together to help youth and their families. This is a great example of a community partner that supports the schools, the parents, and the families, all of them. When pastors of all faiths reach out to give a single message to get more involved in your child's education, big things happen. People listen. And speaking of people that people listen to, our community has a large JROTC, and they are very strict. If the captain tells the kids that they need to get their parents to a meeting, they do. Take advantage of those kinds of things. We also found a great value in affinity groups within corporations. The Black Business Network, IT professionals groups can be really influential, especially because they are people in the community who've succeeded. So, what's in it for them? Make sure that community groups get something out of their relationship as well. Know why they get involved. Why did they get involved in the first place? Ask them. No matter why they got involved, they're more likely to stay involved if they get out of it what they'd hoped. So make sure that you give key partnerships frequent public mention as well. And just a note aside, remember that publicity isn't just newspaper releases anymore. Count on bloggers, school websites. They all can be your best friends. The number of people who want to join a committee is shrinking, and fewer people volunteer simply because they like your organization. We have to tap into the reasons that people or groups want to be involved and then tailor their involvement to deliver the biggest bang for their time spent. You must look for the convergence between what they can offer and what you need. And that little convergence there is your nugget that you have to carry forward. A corporation may be very interested in developing local youth for future workforce. Or a retired computer professional group is a great example. They made it clear from the beginning they didn't want to come to meetings, they wanted to work on computers. When they first talked to us, we had little idea how to use them at all. But now their contribution of refurbished computers is the carrot that gets most of the parents to the table. Poor communication was one of the first barriers that we identified. We certainly didn't want it to be a problem with our partners. People are hungry to know what is going on, but again, don't let your comfort zone dictate what type of communication the community groups receive. This is a know your audience kind of thing. While they were necessary parts of our work, few people wanted to read long research reports or action plans. They wanted to hear stories about successes, see pictures, or be inspired by charts like this one that showed measurable improvements. Lately, we've also used video clips, and we've taken ordinary cell phones or simple digital cameras and interviewed partners or service recipients. And with the help of almost any 15-year-old, those can be cleaned up and are ready to spread the word. So to summarize and wrap it up, I just wanted to show you some of the most valuable contributions our community partners have made. The ones I'm listing in this slide and the next are creative but all very tangible. I just want to tell you, though, that possibly the greatest, most valuable contribution was the things that these people can tell us. Try not to go into the process of engaging families with preconceived ideas. Take the time to ask the community groups how they can help and then be willing to use that information. Pay attention to them, and you don't have to spend quite so much time learning from your mistakes. Don't be afraid to engage with new partners in ways that you never even considered. I'm here to tell you that you can learn a great deal and your program will be better off for that bravery. So Henry Ford said once that coming together is a beginning, keeping together is progress, and working together is success. I'm hoping that you all have great success in this process. And now back to Lindsay.
Thank you, Michelle, for sharing about what other organizations can do to try to build strategic partnerships in support of their own family and community engagement work. We've received a number of questions from our participants. So I'll start with our first question. What is the role of the local school district in driving community school development and implementation? And how did you work with school staff in making sure that they contributed and participated in keeping the online data entered and current?
Well, the partners, this is Michelle, the partners that we had, the school district was extremely supportive from the very beginning. It was a part of our grant that they had to be involved and were the key partner with us when we were building this up. We basically, so we didn't have to worry about their involvement. The online computer tracking system that they used is one that is a purchased system called Infinite Campus, and it was just a mandate from on high that was kept up to date, and it's kept up on real time.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how did you get the pastors involved? And I'd like to also open this question up to any of our other panelists who'd like to chime in.
Okay. Well, I'll start with this, and then everyone else can also chime in. But our Faith Council group was one that was already established. Use things that are already established when you possibly can. And I would say that most pastors have some kind of, most communities have some kind of pastors group that you can use. And we basically worked with them we made their mission our mission, and our mission their mission, to really work together. And we do this on just a daily basis almost.
Are there other panelists that'd like to answer that question? Okay. And I have another question for the panel. And that question is, how is a community school different from our Promise Neighborhoods, and how is it also different from a charter school?
Okay, well, this is Jane. I think that might be for me. I will say that Arne Duncan, the U.S. Secretary of Education, has said publicly on numerous occasions that he thinks of Promise Neighborhoods as the integration of community schools and community development. So if you take those snapshots of community schools, those definitions that I gave earlier, and then think about how that work intersects with the work of community development, I think you see what is happening in Promise Neighborhoods. It was nice to hear that there are 4 schools in the D.C. Promise Neighborhoods planning process that are involved in that neighborhood-wide effort. And I think we also saw there that charter schools and other schools are involved in that effort. There is no reason why there's no reason why every school in the United States can't be a community school. Thinking about a school that, is open longer hours and has these additional services and relationships. And in fact, many charter schools are in fact community schools. So the difference is not, charter schools are about governance, right? That's what we're talking about. A charter school is a school that is that operates often outside the regular school district, and has a board of directors. And so charter schools and community schools are not necessarily different, but the definitions are different because the charter is really about how the school is governed. The community school is how the school relates to its community and whether it has extended hours, services, and relationships. So they're not mutually exclusive by any stretch of the imagination.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and that question is for the entire panel. How did you get businesses involved, and what kind of businesses were ideal to work with? Anyone want to jump in?
I can start. This is Michelle, and I have to say that we looked for the things that businesses were interested in, and then went to them with that. For example, we had a volunteer group that was really interested in training their interns, and so we were able to use them in some kind of leadership roles and things like that. Look for the things that the community wants to make sure happen. We had some Latino businesses within our area that were very interested in making sure that their customers were doing as well as everybody else. So we made use of that, and they came to the table quite willingly to help out with making sure that their customers were aware of all of the educational things that they could participate in.
And this is Jane. Michelle, I thought your advice earlier about the Faith Council is also applicable to the business community, that very often the businesses are organized around a chamber of commerce, or they might be organized as in New York City. We have an organization called Pencil that has done a great job of organizing the business community. I think that that's good advice about going to the places where businesses are already organized. And secondly, I think it is about active listening and finding out what the business community wants to get out of a partnership, and then finding a good fit between what the schools need and what the businesses need to make it. Because we're always looking for a win-win when we talk about community engagement.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And thank you for openly and thoughtfully sharing about the value of creating strategic community partnerships and how these partnerships contribute to the development of systemic learning systems that link in and out of school supports and address the needs of the whole child. We hope that you all enjoyed today's webinar.